Thank you, Susan. I'm Dean Perry. I'm the current chair of the APNS Post-Trauma Services Committee, and I'd like to thank all of you, and we've been thanking each other on the committee for coming out today because it's getting to be such a busy time of the year, to say the least, and especially on a Friday. I also would like to extend a special thank you personally and on behalf of the committee for the people who have come forward and signed up for our volunteer roster for the APNS effort toward post-trauma services. It's very important. I have physically here today sign-up forms for any of you who are still willing to sign up, or if you have close psychology colleagues and friends who might be interested. So we're quite keen to get more people. Today we are pleased to have Dr. Charles Hayes presenting this webinar on psychological first aid. PFA has certainly become a standard model in the area of post-trauma services, and in my representation to the larger disaster response network in Washington just this fall, I certainly realized that all of these people coming from all over the US and these experts talking about PFA and presenting on that, so it's very important. I'm now going to introduce Dr. Janice Howes, who will be outlining some brief history of our committee and the work that we and it has done, other committee members through the years, and followed by Dr. Victor Day, who will be talking about our current agreement and perhaps some of parts of the development of that agreement with the Department of Health and Wellness. So now I'd like to pass it over to Dr. Janice Howes.
Dean. Welcome everyone. I think it's very timely that we're holding this today, 2 days after the 100th anniversary of the Halifax explosion on December 6th, during which we honored the more than 2,000 individuals killed, the more than 9,000 people that were injured, some with life-altering injuries, or many with life-altering injuries, the 6,000 people that were left homeless, and then all the many responders, the healthcare professionals, the thousands of soldiers and citizens who helped in whatever way they could in the search, recovery, and rebuilding efforts afterwards. I've had the privilege of being involved on the APNS Post-Trauma Services Committee for some time now in various capacities. So I am going to provide the history of the work that we have done prior to the negotiations over the last number of years with the Department of Health and Wellness. All right, now, so I have to hold this, right, and then I change here. Okay. All right, I can manage this. All right. We have been a small group of dedicated psychologists that came together to address the need for psychological preparedness and readiness to respond in the event of a disaster, such as a possible aviation accident at the Halifax airport many years ago when that was first introduced as reach out from the Halifax airport to APNS in terms of involvement, but also in terms of natural disasters, which happen in Nova Scotia as they do in other parts of the country. The Westray mine disaster experience also, which was a private industry disaster, had some impact on our thinking as well, and also concern about other mass casualty incidents and events that have happened. I do want to personally take a moment, and on behalf of the committee, to acknowledge the work of the members of this committee over the years, and there's many individuals who have been involved and sat on this committee, but I especially want to acknowledge the tireless work and the vision and advocacy of Dr. Charles Hayes. Mm-hmm. You're welcome. Who has always kept us on course, and also with although we've had frustrations with the process many times, but also with very good humor. So very much appreciate that, Charles. During the 1980s and the 1990s, the committee worked with the Emergency Measures Organization Nova Scotia, and we were very much focused on consulting with them on the psychological impact of disasters. Major emergencies is their terminology in terms of the legislation. And we were focused on victims, survivors, family members, emergency responders, and the general community. And also a lot of discussion around the need for an agreement to activate an APNS disaster volunteer network in the event of a major emergency. The then director of EMO Nova Scotia was the late Mr. Mike Lester, who was a strong supporter of the need for psychosocial response following emergencies and disasters, and certainly saw the value of this service and saw the value of APNS being involved. After much work, discussion, and review by APNS and EMO Nova Scotia, and by the committee at the time, the APNS EMO Memorandum of Understanding for Post-Disaster Psychological Services was signed on February 3rd, 1998. This was a significant accomplishment and milestone for us here, but also in Canada. In fact, this was one of the first agreements of this type between a provincial EMO and a psychological association in Canada. So EMO was quite happy with this as well. The MOU at that time, the 1998 MOU, briefly focused on the definition of major emergency. So it was to affect large numbers of people to the point of traumatization, require large numbers of personnel from many agencies to respond in a pre-established plan, and it was also to overtax the normal capacity of agencies in the public system that may respond in these events. Victims were defined, pro bono services were defined, and the time period roughly in which they were to be provided. How membership in the APNS Disaster Response Network was established. The role of EMO was clearly defined. The committee activity and its responsibilities to APNS, and keeping APNS involved and informed when the disaster response coordinator was contacted by EMO. And EMO was the activating agency of the protocol, and it was only in the event of a major emergency. And we also, in the MOU, included a major emergency response protocol that was very helpful. Over the years following the signing of the MOU in 1998, over the next 10 years, there were up to 60 psychologists listed on the network in the years following. And the support from the community of psychologists was very positive and impressive, and continues to be, as those of you that are here today and that have signed up on the current roster, and those that are joining remotely as well. Our response protocol was only activated once, and that was at the time of the Swissair Flight 111 disaster. Noteworthy that we just signed the MOU in February 1998, and the one time that it was formally activated was in September 2nd and the months following that in 1998. Psychologists responded in many ways, some through their places of employment in terms of the hospital system, but also privately as well in terms of contracts that they may have had with Coast Guard, and there were lots of different roles. Remember that the family member, that flight did not originate or end here. In terms of that's not where it was supposed to land, that is where it ended tragically. But families came from away. So the community that was involved in the initial search and rescue, which quickly turned into a recovery effort, they were also impacted, and there was work that we did there. We also offered some assistance to paramedics, to HRM staff, And we did lots of consultation at the morgue and Shearwater and provided service there. The other thing that we've done, even though that's the only time that the protocol was activated, EMO Nova Scotia and their delegate for the psychosocial disaster response, which is the Department of Community Services at the time, and the Director of Emergency Social Services, Mr. John Webb, who was also very supportive of our efforts and very supportive of psychologists being involved. There were many times in the years following the signing of the MOU that we were contacted and consulted and asked for information or education or recommendations or suggestions. And we did a lot of education about what resources were there and that no, this was not a situation that overtaxed existing resources, but here are some things to watch for. We're available to consult. So one of the events was 9/11. And the issue there was all the flights that were landing in the Halifax airport and all the people that were here for some time. So that was one situation. There was a train derailment at Stewiacke in 2001 and a passenger train, and that was another time that we were consulted. And the seniors apartment building fire, which was Sunrise Manor in 1998, we were also consulted on that one, just to name a few, and there were several others that we were consulted on, including Hurricane Juan. So in approximately 2008, Charles and I guess, were the two members of the committee who contacted EMO Nova Scotia to review and to propose an update of the existing MOU. And the director at that time was Mr. Craig McLaughlin, and we had a very constructive discussion with him, I think, over a couple of meetings. And so at that point, it was decided that for us to have a clearer understanding of the EMO framework of operation for all hazards events, that two committee members should complete the Emergency Management Training Stage 1 course in 2008. And Charles and I completed that at that time, and that was quite interesting and helpful in terms of understanding many different sides of the rollout of EMO's response in the major disaster. Before the MOU was revised, Mr. McLaughlin informed us that the Mental Health Services branch of Department of Health and Wellness had taken over the responsibility for psychosocial response or psychological response to all hazards disaster service. So that was approximately 2010. And then began the process of the interactions with Department of Health and Wellness, which took some time and various starts and stops along the way. But we have made progress with that, and I would like to invite Dr. Victor Day to come up and talk about that.
Great.
Okay.
Can you call up the... Hi, I'm Victor Day, and we're going to talk about I'm going to talk about the current situation and try to give you a basic overview of where we stand now and how things might work if there were a disaster in Nova Scotia. Let me just, it's useful because people use words differently, so just to, it's my university training to find the terms. Because people in the literature and locally will use different words for basically the same thing. Major critical incident is a term I think is often used in the professional literature, MCI. That could also, by the way, stand for mass casualty incident, MCI, or major emergency, which is how the Department of Health and Wellness refers to it. That's the term they use in their emergency planning. Or I use the word disaster. I like the word disaster because it not only has the correct denotation, it has a kind of right emotional connotation. And we don't get into funny gymnastics of saying, well, a multi-car accident with multiple casualties, that's not a major disaster or not a major emergency. I wouldn't want to get into a situation where we're kind of saying that to people. that's only a minor emergency. But I think the word disaster conveys something that's mass, something that's large, and not just a incident in which various people were killed or apartment burned or something like that. So those are all bad things, but we're talking about disasters. Operationally, of course, in a philosophical way, what's the operational definition of disaster concerning our possible involvement? Basically, it's operationally defined as an event which cannot be sufficiently handled by resources currently in the public health system. That's what defines the magnitude of the event. So first, the Nova Scotia Health Authority, of course, will handle things, and then when they cannot handle things, I'll explain later, then that's when we may be called in. So that's the defining aspect of the magnitude of the disaster. This is my personal thoughts. There's no research on such things other than I reflected on it and I thought, well, what are we really talking about? What's likely to happen? So here's my personal thoughts. It's not in a document anywhere. But, naturalistic disasters, by the way, earthquakes, floods, hurricanes, volcanoes, causing mass casualties are extremely unlikely here. We're blessed. Nova Scotia is blessed by geography in many ways, but one of the ways we're blessed is that we don't have that level of natural disasters. I was here for Hurricane Juan. Yes, of course we had that. That was not actually a disaster in the way we defined it. There were 2 casualties, I think, and I lost power for 9 days, but nevertheless, that was not a disaster. So we don't even get that level of hurricanes. There are disasters related to human activity that are infrequent but quite possible here. A prominent one all in our minds now in Halifax anyway, as Janice referred to, is the Halifax explosion. I've been reading about the Halifax explosion, as some of you may have been, and by the way, if it happened today, the estimates would be 20,000 killed and something like 50,000 casualties, which of course is way beyond the capacity of any system to handle, right? So, also my reading of the Halifax explosion, Boileau's book was interesting. He described 3 near misses of disaster level explosions during World War II. The magazine fire, which killed some but wasn't of disastrous proportions, but could have been. And there were 2 ammunition ships that caught fire in serious ways while in Halifax Harbor. And the fires were put out, and in one case, the ship was scuttled, so it sank rather than, and those things weren't even known at the time. And it was just another little aside I find kind of interesting, was that if there were a major military near miss recently, we wouldn't know about it, just as people at the time didn't know about those near misses. So who knows? But we are in Halifax, a major military location. Also, of course, there was a recent near miss of a mass shooting in Halifax, the almost Valentine's Day massacre at the Halifax shopping center, which was averted just the day before because one of the 3 people, of course, had second thoughts and told somebody. That was a near miss of a mass shooting, maybe of Las Vegas style, magnitude. Swiss Air, which was classified as a disaster, of course, and could have been much worse if Swiss Air stayed in the air another 30 seconds or a minute on its planned route back to the airport. It would have landed on the land, most likely in a populated suburban area of Halifax, and it would have been a much larger magnitude incident. And not to scare our clients who have flying phobias, but we are on a major flyway between Europe and Boston, Washington, New York. You see them in the summer, especially if there are, I'm not sure how many, I think it's more than 100, well more than 100, a couple hundred planes go over Nova Scotia transatlantic every day. Any one of them could fall onto any part of Nova Scotia. That's just the facts of the situation. So it's not just Halifax International Airport, it's Sydney, it's Antigonish, it's Canso. All those places are equally likely. So that's our situation. And that's our next disaster, thinking through, is will probably be, and I say next disaster because the history of Nova Scotia is there's one not often, but sooner or later. Our next disaster will be sudden, episodic, single event, without warning, and probably localized because it's related to human activity. It's some sort of terrorist event, mass shooting, major explosion or crash of some sort. That's happened very quickly. Boom, there's a big event. It's localized, and then we're going to have to handle that. So that sort of thing. So that's very likely what we'll be handling at some point. Currently on the roster, how we handle that. We have 46 psychologists, including some from each region of Nova Scotia. That's by intention. When we didn't have enough, I got on the phone and got some in certain regions. And actually, we have gotten 2 more today, so we're up to 48 and hope to be over 50 by the end of the day. We'll see. Our disaster response coordinator, DRC, will be the first person in the following list who is available. Myself, Victor Day, Janice Howes, and Dean Perry. You have to provide for the fact that someone might not be available. We're not on 24-hour call. Someone could be away on vacation, or someone could be affected by the disaster. The Nova Scotia Health Authority will be responsible for, this is the current situation, will be responsible for providing health, including psychological services following a disaster. And those of you who work in the health system know there's been changes even with respect to the roles of the Department of Health and Wellness and the Nova Scotia Health Authority and reorganization. And so, but basically, it's the NSHA, the Health Authority, who are responsible. And they will, though, of course, they will be under the overall, in the event of a major emergency, will be under the overall coordination with respect to those services of the Department of Health and Welfare. And within that, there's the Director of Health Services Emergency Management, who will be the person who requests our services and coordinates any national arrangement, any necessary arrangements. Currently, that person's name is Russell Stewart. So there's a person who sits, and I've seen the room. It's kind of sort of like this. There's a big room with nicer chairs, by the way, really fancy chairs and all sorts of electronic equipment ready for an emergency. They have a special room there in the Department of Health and Wellness. It's an impressive room. And he would be sitting there along with a group of, looks like 15 or 20 people, all coordinating various aspects of emergency services, right? And so if in those meetings, basically, the Department of, or the Nova Scotia Health Authority indicates that they need extra help, then they will, then he may call upon us and call the disaster, and then we'll make some decision. Okay. Now, so if when they indicate it, then now they will first go through their own emergency procedures, of course. They'll handle things locally wherever the location is. They may bring people from other parts of their system in to handle that type of situation. And then after that, as a kind of third choice, people like us may be called upon for possible activation. Now, note that, as Janice alluded to, if we have to agree to that. They could request, and we could say it's not large enough. So we have to agree. They can't just call us in. They don't even have the roster, right? So they would have to talk to our DRC, and then if we agree, then we'll contact volunteers in the roster within the relevant region, plan specific arrangements, locations, briefings for our volunteers, and then request volunteers to go to the specific locations at specific times. Very straightforward type of arrangement. We would likely provide psychological first aid within so-called psychosocial support centers, that's the term used locally, or family support centers, established nearby the local hospitals or clinics, but possibly in some other community location if for some reason those places have been affected. Such centers would be established close enough to the location of the disaster to meet local needs. People probably have to be able to walk there from the hospital to get there soon, but far enough away to be physically safe and functional. So our volunteers would never be asked to go to a dangerous situation. That would be contrary to psychological first aid anyway. before beginning any help, we'll provide you with a briefing, an overview of the nature of the situation, what the emergency support services are available, and where to refer people who may need further help. To some degree, you may be useful sources of information to people, so of course you have to get some information in order to provide that. The expectation is that psychologists local to the area who will be more conveniently nearby and won't have to travel and will be knowledgeable of local service, that's the expectation that people will call upon, something in your area. But in a very large-scale disaster, people might be asked to go to another region. So that's probably unlikely. Although officially, our roster can be activated only after the NSA and then the Department of Health and Wellness asks for help. In the event of an obvious major disaster, we will probably initiate contact with them. We'll call Russell Stewart and say, we saw this happen. Okay, remember, we have this available. Let's have a preliminary discussion of what we might be doing and kind of not wait for the health authority to say, oh, well, we're overwhelmed, help us now, that sort of thing. If a number of our volunteers are activated and provide service, we'd like to have some sort of group meeting later, an operational review. It's not a critical incident stress debriefing, it's an operational review to talk about how it went and that sort of thing. Though it would be the role of the DRC at that meeting to identify, I suppose, any psychologist who seemed unusually affected by their work and then talk about what further help they might want, if that were to happen. Our website has a manual written by Charles, and so if you go, that's the actual.
It's the PDF.
Yeah.
So,
If you go to APNS website, about APNS and the Post-Trauma Services Committee, it's listed there. The form to fill out for the roster is there, and the actual manual's there. Great.
and I should say that after this is over, I'm going to be resorting the information, so I'll bring it up front, so it'll be easier to find.
And that's our current situation. Good. There'll be an opportunity for questions at the end. Great.
Hi, I'm Charles Hayes. I'm going to try to walk you through psychological first aid because it's quite a different animal than we have been using in the past. And I think it's important that you understand some of these differences. As others have pointed out, there are all kinds of things that have happened in natural disasters, mainly in the US, but they've had a profound influence here in Canada as well. There have been the train wreck at Lac Mégantic, so we know that we're pushing fuel through Halifax as well, and these things happen all of a sudden without warning at any time. We've recently had the Las Vegas shooting. We're not likely to get a mass gun homicide like that in Canada because of our much more stringent rules, but we still get the occasional high school shootings. And it's only when the government here, their health services are overwhelmed that we get called in. We will not get called in unless they can't meet the need. So this is how we try to save you from being overworked. In the past, when they've had questions, there was often questions to Janice about, couldn't you come and help us? No, you are not overwhelmed. She was the best no-sayer that I know. And over time, we've been trying to negotiate since 2008 with the government to show them the value of what we have. And so it's been steadfast and often at our behest and not theirs. So what I want to do is to sort of walk you through what happens when there is a disaster, because don't expect that everything is going to be neat and tidy, because it won't be. When a disaster happens suddenly, and there are many injuries, the very first thing that happens is that those who are the least injured on their own or by friends go to the hospitals. As soon as they do, they start to clog up emergency department procedures. And those are quickly put into surgery. So they tie up surgical beds as well. Then the next thing that happens is by this time the emergency medical people are coming in with their ambulances with much more seriously wounded people. And the triage system is already fouled. So the department has to all of a sudden get places for psychosocial support, for family support, up and running. It all takes time. And in taking time, there is more and more peculiar things happening. And so we wanted to be ready on our side at least with, okay, here's what's happening, and here's what's going to happen. So on this slide, you will see that there's a number of different things that are happening in terms of what's happening at the hospital. And I wanted to show you that it's not just patients that are arriving, because in most disasters, there is a phenomenon of people losing track of friends and family. And specifically in Canada, we tend to use the hospitals as our first go-to, so that they start to go to the hospitals as well. And this is a wonderful opportunity for crooks. They go to, because this is the time you can steal drugs, and there's all kinds of people in the hospital, and people are overwhelmed with trying to make the damn thing work. So it becomes really hectic really quickly. And that can happen even when it is not a mass disaster. One school bus will be enough to cause that kind of disruption in our system. So it's really important that you understand that when you get called, it may be hugely chaotic. But what we do use a triage system. So I want to show you where we fit in the triage system. The first part of the triage system is black. And this is where the physicians have to make a decision. And the decision is you're either dead or you're totally expected not to be able to live no matter what superhuman intervention we make. So they sometimes have tough things. You have to tell a family member, I can't do anything for that patient even though he's still alive. Right? So you get a lot of emotional turmoil at these places. We don't see black, of course, and nor do we see red. Red are those that need surgical interventions or some sort of medical intervention that will help save their lives. And then there's the yellow, which is those that need investigative procedures of some sort so they can be sorted. We don't come in until green, which is the walking wounded, they sometimes call, you know, like these are minor injuries, but all the psychological injuries happen there as well. So these people get hived off that have psychological difficulties into one of two places. If not always, like if there is somebody who is hysterical or somebody who cannot calm themselves, they will not be sent to where you guys are most likely to be working with. They'll be sent into the hospital system where they can be administered medications and have psychological and psychosocial services that can hit them with that. Because what you don't want to happen, you don't want them contaminating everybody else, because our body languages are very transferable. So if somebody is really upset, it tends to upset everybody else around them. So there's always this business of trying to keep things at a low pace. So there's the green patients. Um, there's two conditions that you will sometimes see. Multiple unexplained psychological symptoms, which are, they don't know why they happen, but a group of people may come in with the same symptomatology. Or you get the mass psychogenic illness, which is similar, but it just means that somebody can be talking about a threat, and everybody sees the threat, and their anxiety goes way up, and so they're manifesting all kinds of anxiety and whatnot, and it looks very common, but you don't have to worry about that, because we're not going to be treating that or diagnosing. We don't do any of this. Under psychological first aid, you should know that it's really a system that has been designed for lay people. And what I'm trying to do today is to say we can put psychological overlays on it to make us much more effective, because as a group, we are used to strong emotions. That doesn't frighten us. We feel, maybe not comfortable, but we feel adequate in dealing with that kind of thing. So we can calm people by our own body language and our own demeanor, that it's a very powerful stabilizing effect. During the Gulf War, I wanted to show some of these effects. Iraq launched a series of Scud missile strikes against Israel. There was widespread anticipation of chemical strikes. Many people close to the missile contact who were not physically injured presented with respiratory distress and believed that they had been exposed to gas. Yet on an analysis, none of the Scud missiles had any chemical warheads. And yet there were hundreds of people presenting at the hospitals, complaining about chest and breathing, respiratory problems. It just goes on and on. So if an idea hits, it can lock in like that. There it is. Sorry. The way we have our system set up is that you will be contacted by Victor or Janice or Dean. In the past, it's always been kind of difficulty because you want to call and say, what can I do? But it's better if it comes the other way around. You're on the roster, we know where to find you, we will do that. It may be contacts for another member of the roster, and they'll identify themselves. We'll report here or we'll report there. And Victor's absolutely right. The protocol says that the Department of Health and Wellness will contact us, but we will contact them. It seems like when they get overwhelmed, they forget things. Not like us. There are certain assumptions you should make. And the first assumption is that no matter how distressed the individual is, expect normal recovery. The data is really clear. Most people faced with a disaster or trauma recover. So that becomes your operational point. You're going to get better. But you don't tell them that, but that's your assumption, right? And all that psychological first aid tries to do is to promote normal recovery. And you assume that the survivors that you're dealing with are confident. They will be able to manage for themselves. Some won't, and then you do your triage and you send them off. But most are going to be able to cope. And especially if you approach them in a quiet, calm manner, because they'll pick up your body language. If you're calm, I must be okay. And you try to recognize what strengths they have. You promote resiliency by giving them things that they can do to help themselves. Like if they need water, you say you can get water over there, and or if they were searching for a loved one, you say, okay, there's a list over here, why don't you go have a look at it? And you, just by directing in a positive way, you help stabilize that. And you show them what resources are available for them. You should know, too, that you are not going to be unaffected by the disaster. It will affect you. Expect that. It affects individuals, it affects the community, and all of these extraordinary circumstances aren't in our common experiences. So you expect that. The things that you see, people grieving, people having high anxiety, expect that, right? That's normal. So when they're really upset, you go, well, I know that's okay. That won't bother anything. You want to try to spin it in a way that you're putting a positive adaptation on that, so that it helps them get orientated what they have to do. Use your behavioral health support systems, and things like helping them breathe, just the common things that you can help people relax with. Those kinds of tools are really helpful at those times. So if you are being interactive and positive and helpful, they pick up on that. Sometimes, though, you're going to get people that say, I don't want any help. And I want you to agree to that. Do not force yourself on them. Do not make them listen. Do not make them tell their stories. All of those things are not required. What you do is say, I'll be back to check on you later to see how you're doing, if that's okay, right? Because you want to give them control over what's happening. Even if, you said that one, sorry. You want to be flexible, empowering, helpful. And you want to do no harm. And that's that bit about don't make them participate. They may not be ready for it. One of the best things you can do is just sit with them silently, because they're processing. And that's a very helpful thing for them to be doing. And if you're sitting there and not pressing them, then they're more likely to be responsive to you and start working with you. There's going to be legal and disaster relief things that you can steer them to, behavioral health services that you can put them through, and most of all, you want support from the family and friends, because there is huge benefit in that. The WebMD Health News on September 21st, 2017, the evacuation order for Hurricane Irma was bearing down in Florida, and Maria Mendez, a 68-year-old English professor from Cutler Bay, about 30 miles south of downtown Miami, followed the steps she knew well. She readied the house, putting up storm shutters, taking furniture in from the patio, wrapping valuables and paintings. She was prepared. Suddenly, however, Maria ran from the house in fright. Her husband and daughter had to lead her back into the house and try to calm her. The family safely evacuated the house, so there's no harm so far. Maria understood what had happened. Preparing the house reminded her of Hurricane Andrew in 1992, when the family had declared to weather the storm in Hurricane Andrew, the house sustained heavy damage, and the family is fearful they would die. The bathroom ceiling had collapsed, the roof had blown away. She was subsequently diagnosed with PTSD. Her reaction now and then for psychologists would not be unexpected. In any major disaster, the immediate concerns are of survival, eating, drinking, finding a place to sleep. Experts notice a pattern of mental health symptoms after disasters. The PTSD treatment and research program at University Medical Center, usually what we see first is the anxiety and fear. But now you know anybody who's been through prior trauma are going to be much more likely to show an excess amount of emotionality. So what do we do? Oops. I fixed that but forgot to save it. There we go. You want to secure basic needs and provide psychological first aid, conduct a needs assessment, trying to prioritize who needs most help early, monitor the rescue and recovery environment, provide outreach and information dissemination, deliver technical assistance, consultation, training, foster resilience and recovery, conduct triage and referral, and provide treatment. The National Institute of Mental Health performed an extensive evidence-based literature review followed by 2 rounds of expert consensus development conferences. They identified the following components for early survivors of disasters. NIMH report defines psychological first aid as a pragmatically oriented intervention with survivors or emergency responders targeting acute stress reactions and immediate needs. Several different models of PFA have since emerged. The goals of PFA include the establishment of safety, stress-related symptom reduction, restoration at rest, sleep, linkage to critical resources, and connection to social supports. Now, typically, support centers and family centers are located off from hospitals. And it's important that they be separated because you don't want the ambulances coming in and distressing them. The field of disaster behavioral health is relatively new, and it attempts to improve the capability of disaster responders to volunteer psychologists to perform optimally in the face of adversity. The support centers and family centers are focused on safety and setting away the upsetting sites, as I say, and hospital staff may be supplemented with volunteers such as you people. The support center psychological casualties are referred to the support center for observation and care. And when they have regained emotional control and thinking that they can make decisions, then they are referred to the family centers. So the acute psychosocial part is this social support center, and the family part becomes a different center for more calming things and trying to find missing members of the families and this kind of thing. So part of the reason of having those off site is to keep the population of unwanted people down in the hospitals a lot. So in psychological first aid, there's a physical health. So it's making sure that everybody is safe and secure. And you ask questions like the blue there, are you feeling safe here? And it's really important that you never deceive the people that you're talking to. If all heck is breaking out next door, you don't tell them it's all fine, right? You may say, that it's still not controlled or whatever, but be frank with them. You have to watch for people too that could be wanting to harm themselves in some way. You know, I should have done this and I'm so miserable, I'm going to kill myself. They have to be put back through triage and into a system, because we don't do therapy. Psychological first aid, you're not doing any therapy. So you have to pull back from that. And we all know, you know, like the Maslow's hierarchy of needs, that's going to be the thing that governs where we are in the page. None of it. So when you're looking at people that are maybe harm themselves, you want to know those who may have escaped somehow physical injury detection during triage, and they have to be sent back, or have been intensely exposed to the disaster, or displaced from home or work. And a lot of times in hurricanes and things, those have had their property destroyed. These and those who are bereaved are going to be experiencing a lot more anxiety. Now, in psychological first aid, they divide it all up into different groups. And so you try to match your skills with the groups that are in need. So if you were a geriatric psychologist, we don't want to see you working with children, right? We want strength to strength. So the psychological first aid is an attempt to ameliorate initial distress and to help people in the long run to adapt better. Psychological first aid and critical incident stress debriefing differ in that psychological first aid attempts to use only those components of critical incident stress debriefing that work while avoiding those that potentially could cause harm. And there's the huge difference between what we would have done in '98 versus now. In '98, we had a much more definable role. Now this, under psychological first aid, is a lot less definable. Neither psychological first aid or critical incident stress debriefing has shown demonstrable proof of reducing, say, the development of PTSD. So it becomes known, psychological first aid, they try to get rid of everything that may cause harm, and they say it's a informed approach by having these groups like mental health associations going through and say, we have data that this part works, we have data that part works, let's use it. So you're wanting to, you can read that. In the Institute of Medicine in 2003, in the past decade, there's been a growing movement to develop a concept similar to physical first aid for coping with stressful and traumatic events in life. The strategy is now commonly referred to as psychological first aid. So it's a mirror of what's happening in medicine. And it's also trying to reduce harm. It creates and sustains an environment of safety, calming, connectedness, self-efficiency, empowerment, and hopefulness. So those are the themes that you're trying to get across. So it's, as I said, it's an evidence-informed modular approach. Non-invasive, respectful. It is the provision of comfort, safety, addressing immediate practical concerns that the survivors face, promoting goal orientation. So every time you can have them specifically do A, B, or C, it really helps. And giving them information on goal-solving strategies. So many of those are similar to what you would have done in critical incident stress debriefing, but limit the stress reaction and improve overall functioning, having the same goal. But do not encourage, as they said, do not encourage them to tell their story. Do not disencourage them if they're telling their story, even if they're repetitive. Like, this happened to me, this happened to me, that's fine, right? If you go for an online search of psychological first aid, you'll see many, many different forms of it. And they're all okay. Each, like Red Cross has one, and every organization has one. And as I said earlier, psychological first aid is delivered by lay people. So you're going to be beside a housewife and a truck driver doing the same things. These are volunteers. And it is administered immediately following any disaster, and anywhere I could think of, I put in a list where they would be, right? And that's what will happen to us in all likelihood. Safety is always the main thing. The core action, contact and engagement, safety, comfort, you can read all that. The information gathering to facilitate rapid assessment, field-tested, evidence-informed strategies, developmentally and culturally appropriate, practical tools. Those are what it's all about. So, offer protection. That's why you're in a support center, because that is out of harm's way. And it's important to do little kindnesses, may I get you some water? May I, these kinds of things. Just establish rapport. And so you're trying to enhance their feeling that they're now in a safe place, that things are okay. And you want to empower action so that they can return as quickly as possible to normal routines, to normal functioning. And there's an educational component what you can do as well, and telling you that, okay, I can see this happening, and so on. So you orientate to things, tell them where the services can be found. And ask them questions about what they need, like what problems are you facing now? Then you can help them with problem solving, and who might be able to help you. Some are going to be easier than others, like finding water, but locating missing ones, there's probably forms to be filled out. You have to know whether they can fill them out, help them fill out the forms. And so you're just like a buddy, sort of. You want to help them have that safety and control feeling. Would you like me to sit with you? Remember, it's not intrusive, it's respectful. So you're always requesting, not telling. That's a huge difference in the critical incident stress one, where it's much more demanding and much more involved in eliciting it. We don't, in psychological first aid, we don't do that. When you're being reassuring, though, do not lie. Don't make it up, because if you are wrong, it will have ramifications that are really important. One of the really interesting things that you can do if somebody is really out of control vocally, so they're screaming, try this. It always worked for me. Speak very slowly and very quietly. If it doesn't work, speak slower and quieter. And all of a sudden, the other person will be talking quietly. Really simple, but it works. So your body language is incredibly important. Um, listen carefully, you know, so you pick up what they're concerns about, um, and try to help them with those kinds of solutions. Listen with compassion. Do not be judgmental. Like, for God's sake, smarten up. None of that, right? You want to be just being there for them will be helpful, even if you don't do anything. As I said earlier, some people want to talk about the traumatic responses. Let them, because they're processing that. Others don't want to talk about it. Don't make them, right? So I put a little blurb there on active listening. The silence is to be encouraged. So if they're comfortable with you sitting there and they're not talking, that's fine. You're still having an effect. So, and you know that stuff, you know, like paraphrase what they're saying to make sure you have it correct and reflect their feelings, show expressions of emotion that you're doing fine, and so on, right? So when people aren't doing so well, if they're disoriented or confused or any of the things on that long list, you decide how best to help them. Can they still be helped where you are, or should they be re-referred? That's the kind of decisions you're going to make. And if they're able to listen at all, you can give them like some calming exercise to do. You may find that's all they require. So, you know, that's where your judgment comes in, and it makes you a much more valuable psychological first aid practitioner than, say, the truck driver next door, right? So these signs are all those that would signal a warning of some sort that that they're overwhelmed. And if you can't get them, then a referral. Don't leave them sitting there. You know, like this group does need extra help. The psychoeducational part is really important. You know that in critical incident stress debriefing, they were always talking about this is a normal reaction to an abnormal situation. That's not a bad thing to say. That kind of orientates them that, oh, this must be okay, or this is common. You know, like in this kind of disaster, we see this kind of behavior. It doesn't mean you're losing your mind. You know, that things are fine. And you're going to, in all likelihood, you're going to feel better in time. This is your mind and body's way of reacting to that. That's all good to say. So, what you don't say, it could have been worse, right? All of those things that we're sometimes tempted to say. I think one of our federal ministers said about the thalidomide used to be much worse. And you saw all the terrible brouhaha that resulted from that little misspeak. And above all, I know how you feel. You don't. Please don't say that.
Or you're lucky that. Lucky that is difficult. Yeah.
Yes. And again, you always want to link them in as quickly as you can to family and friends as support systems. So when you see these things that are clear that the person is emotionally overwhelmed, you want to try to help them get what they need to regain control over their own lives. And remember, I said it has to be respectful. So you're acknowledging their right to privacy. You're giving them time alone if they wish time alone. I don't want you to sit with me. Go away. Please go away. But remember that you're going to say, I'll come back and check on you, right? And offer them little kindnesses that will help. So you're trying to tell them things about how emotions normally work, that they come in waves, and that, you know, that if you like, I will show you how you might be able to handle the next wave, you know, things like that. Or would you like to sit with your friends? I thought, you know, so-and-so over there, yes, please, you know. So you try to make sure that they maintain eye contact with you, that they're looking at you, that they know where they are, what is happening to them, that they're oriented, that they can describe their surroundings and things and clarify what's happening. If they're doing all of those things, they're coping, right? Maybe not well, but they are coping a little bit. You try to keep families and friends together above all else. And if they're separate, you try to relink them in. This is one of the most distressing things in most disasters, is losing contact and not knowing what has happened to family and friends. And that's why it's so important. So your job all the time is to model being calm and in control, even if you don't feel it, because it really helps them. You want to keep children with their parents or with other adults who will help calm them. You want to help them understand that being with friends is really important. So in behavioral health, what we try to do is effective risk communication, specific information, what to do and when, and what is current. Now these things are really important. Let's say it's a natural disaster. You really want to know, and part of our role is to find out in the social centers and the family centers who knows what is happening, because we become the link between that and the individual survivors. So we want our information to be as current as we can in order to help them to cope better. And it's no good to be able to say, I don't know, right? So you, what did I hit here? Okay.
Oh, you got it back.
Yep.
Don't do that again.
You try to validate what they're saying. And validation, normalization, the experience stress response is incredibly helpful. So just remember that. But again, I'll rephrase, do not invent it. Do not make up things, because the risks are too great. And as long as all of these things are survived, right there, then if those immediate things are okay, then subsequently you want to know what's coming next. And it's just common sense. Tell the truth as it is known and what is being done. And sometimes you're going to use clinical judgment, and you're not going to tell them about how terrible it is. If they're already distressed, you don't want to add a level. Be forthright about what is not known. So you're trying to be as honest and open as you can be, given their state of emotionality. And always try to give them practical things to do. Again, the most useful information, that which provides assistance in addressing immediate needs, reducing fears, answering pressing questions, those kinds of things. Clear and concise language. So a lot of those you can read on your sheets. Towards disaster recovery, you need a simple plan, guidance, and these support centers are only going to be in operation for a specific length of time. They're not going to be there for a long time. So once you get most people stabilized, they will disappear, won't be needed anymore. The service then will revert to the Nova Scotia Health Authority, which will use hospitalized personnel. In Swiss Air 111, people came in from other provinces to help. Our province with neighboring provinces have agreements that should a major disaster occur, then the provinces will help one another, and the federal government. So that's why we think our role is going to be short-lived, and at that point of utmost chaos. So our job is to help stabilize everything for other people coming in. So empowerment becomes a major thing, give short, small, bite-sized things for them to do, so that they get the feeling that they have more control over their lives than they had a few seconds ago. A lot of it's going to be referral to Nova Scotia Health Authority for those that aren't making wonderful progress. So you're going to refer those that you find that are disoriented and not responsive, those that are in hyperarousal, anything that is likely to contaminate those about them. Of course, if you see somebody dissociating, as you know, there is a strong bond between dissociation at the acute stage and PTSD. So these people have to be referred on as well. And PTSD, of course, never or seldom ever occurs alone. So you look for its buddies, depression and anxiety, and particularly those that have mental health issues already may be targets for sending over to Nova Scotia Health Authority. If anybody is unable to care for themselves, not washing, not eating, refer them right away. And always watch suicidal ideation. It is particularly bad when friends are killed. You'll see it in veterans all the time. I should have been there. The guilt component can rise extremely quickly with disastrous results. Our job, always, safety, calming. Catch up here. Where did I go too far? There we go. There. The use of alcohol and drugs to control the emotionality is not a good idea. So you really want to disabuse that when you see it. Watch for people acting out, domestic violence and child or elder abuse. These things happen when people are distressed, so you have to be on the watch for that. But I think you will find, as most agencies have found, that the use of psychological first aid works quite well. But as I said, there's no hard evidence that you're going to reduce PTSD. But agency after agency have taken this approach and have stopped using critical incident stress debriefing and those forms. The long paper that I wrote outlines in detail why that happened, and even if you just look at that one section, and you'll understand better why the committee and I went to psychological first aid and walked away from critical incident stress debriefing, talking about it as a single intervention having some sort of effect. We're not really doing therapy, but we really are helping. Are there any questions? Yes.
Just wondering, we're doing psychological first aid, we're not doing therapy, we're not doing any intervention as psychologists. How should we introduce ourselves?
I like that question. I would introduce myself as a psychologist. I would if I were one. Technically, I'm not anymore.
He's just retired, right, yeah,
Yes.
yeah.
We will be there, in a way officially asked by the emergency coordination, and we'll be there as, a lot of psychologists. So, yes, you can introduce yourself as a
We just don't want to
psychologist.
set up that expectation that
Yes.
we'll be acting as we do elsewhere as psychologists.
That's right, because we're acting differently, and
Yes.
we may need to, someone says, oh, yeah, by the way, and they want to start what looks like
Yes.
therapy, then,
Yes.
then of course, we just explain, well, that's right now, I'm just providing immediate support.
But all the brief techniques you have, you can still use.
Yes.
And you will have those where other lay people won't. So,
And that sensitivity of when, of listening and picking up on when people want to talk and tell their story versus those that are really hesitant and are not quite ready. Because that was always an issue with critical incident stress debriefing. And in our earlier mandate with the MOU, we didn't adopt a specific model of debriefing. It was more stress management. And we did it in a very, a much less structured manner than, less structured manner than the Mitchell model. So again, I think a lot of the skills that we have as a psychologist transfer.
thanks.
Yes?
There's a lot of coordination between people who are giving psychological first aid and others. So my assumption would be that there would be perhaps a team like the post-trauma committee who would be giving us that information and helping us know where to send people. Just practical stuff, obviously, but that's perhaps up in the hierarchy, a step above where we're expected, and so everything that we're given and expected to share will be given to us, so there's no need to look for that information. You know who we are and where we are. Cool.
That would be
Good
our
point.
expectation, that we will get information either from Russell Stewart, or if it'd probably be a local person near the disaster who, would be hopefully providing briefing to psychologists who would go and volunteer, and we'd try to set it up that way. But it might work, it'll kind of come from him to one of us, and we'll give it to you if it has to work that way. But ideally, it would be a local person who would brief you before you actually went to a support center or a psychosocial support center or family center.
We didn't talk about all kinds of disasters because there's always the N1, H1 flu or disasters, which tend to be widespread and tend to absolutely disrupt all emergency services because people refuse to go to work, and you get all, it's just cascades. And I admit our committee and nor me have an adequate response for that, so it depends on what's happening, I guess.
No, and I think that's a really good point of an example of a situation that may evolve quite differently. And with Swiss Air, the time frame for response turned into weeks. And even in phase 2, they wanted to activate us again, and that was a month from the time of the actual tragedy. But just getting back to your question too, as Victor was saying, we have whoever's contacted, or as disaster response coordinator, we're contacting Department of Health and Wellness, because we certainly did that with EMO as well as things arose, and kept reminding them we were here and what we could do and what we couldn't do. So we have a number of questions too of information that whoever's working as disaster response coordinator, in terms of finding out some of those logistics and how it's staging and where people need to go and what's needed and all of that. Because most disasters or major emergencies, there's some sort of steering committee that's functioning, and then we're pulled into that or consulted after meetings and such. So that information should be forthcoming.
And I don't know if there's any questions online, or you
Charles, I just had a point or a question, I guess. You know, because we live in a diverse cultural community here and worldwide, obviously, you know, if even in fact the Swiss airplane had survivors and one of those many planes that now I'm worried about that Vic talks about that flies over crashed, or we would be getting really an immersion into different cultures, different people coming, different people we must respond to, and I'm sure that's, as I say, a whole nother level, but that's obviously something I'm assuming that in preparation going into a situation that one must prepare for.
They're much further developed in the U.S., where they have, you know, large population divergences, and so they developed like protocol for Hispanics or protocol for blacks. We have, our committee has not done that yet.
No.
A number of years ago, when the Kosovo refugees were coming here, and many of them were coming to Halifax and being housed, and I don't know which version of the health system organization it was at the point, but I think it was the central Capital Health, I think, was in place at that point. And there was a lot of briefing and a lot of work that we did with that group coming, knowing that when they were coming, but that was all pretty quickly arranged. So I think there is some sensitivity to that, but so many of these events are happening suddenly that there are some resources to pull together, but that would need to be done.
But psychological first aid does require you to be sensitive to those kinds of differences.
Yeah. And there was a question down here.
So, thank you. I wanted to ask a couple of questions. One is that, as a follow-up to what Dean was mentioning, just I'm wondering what kind of coordination, and if you have a sense of this, the Department of Health and Wellness does with, for example, interpretation services. So because language, of course, could be a huge barrier. I mean, obviously, you can still sit with somebody regardless, and I'm not saying that, you know, you need language for everything. But I would imagine a lot of having a sense of the state of our interpretation services. I imagine most of those people would be in the emergency room and in medical, but I was wondering if we have a sense of that. And then my second question, I was just wondering if you had a sense of, within the Nova Scotia Health Authority, what the, you know, the counterpart or who it is who is involved in terms of coordinating that response within even the Nova Scotia Health Authority.
I think I'm going to have to say I don't know to the first question or answer the second one. In terms of interpretation services, I mean, that's beyond our committee or our level of organization.
But
so,
a few of us from Nova
yes.
Scotia Health Authority can comment.
Yes, that's right. I don't. But yeah, that would be for the Nova Scotia Health Authority to arrange. I mean, there are services, there are arrangements now within the normal system, so I assume they would be used in some way. And I don't actually know. I mean, it will be coordinated at various levels. They have their own internal plans, and you may be able to comment on that.
Who's in charge of that?
That there may be different people in charge of different aspects. There is that, as I said, I know that Russell Stewart sits on this coordinating group that has 10, 20 people on it, and there'd be at least one or probably more people from the Nova Scotia Health Authority on that. I don't know their title. Yeah.
Just in terms of interpretation services, the Health Authority has worked on that over the last several years quite extensively. And now, as long as phones are working, you can access quite significant interpretation services in multiple languages. So my assumption would be, working within the Health Authority, that would be readily available to us. So interpretation services should be, and Jennifer, you're nodding your head too. Yeah, and that, a lot of that is done that way now within the health authority, because some of the, with new immigrants and the languages that are being spoken, we may not have interpreters here live. We still do some of that as well with some of the more frequent languages, but but that is a model that works very well within health appointments and such. So that is a system that's working. And I would agree with you. Russell Stewart would be the contact, and then how that would filter down through in terms of the emergency preparedness within the overall health authority, and then how it would filter down to the facilities. So, yeah.
You don't have a sense of the managers that are involved?
The health authority has just been accredited as one health authority
No, so
recently.
yeah.
So it's the whole province now without the IWK. The IWK is separate. So I'm aware of certain individuals that report or involved in that, but oftentimes they will pull together a larger group. So, but Russell Stewart would be the point person.
Other questions? Or online? Okay. Do you want to make closing comments, Dean?
Yes, okay, please. Thank you.
Final intriguing.
I have
sign
something
off.
just to add to that. Being in the, intriguing maybe not, but being in rural Nova Scotia Health Authority now, we too have access to the interpretation services, and it seems to be a very nice model. One question I just had myself, Charles, I remember a story that you related concerning the Swiss Air response, which I was not a part of it at the time. And I remember you talking about an individual, very generally, who was in a position who insisted over a period of time that he or she deal with you exclusively, that when you showed up, well, I want to see Dr. Hayes, I will not deal with anyone else. And the idea of psychological first aid is short term, but I'm assuming that there are going to be people who, because of a trust issue and because you intervene, want you in particular, and maybe even want to contact you after all this is over. And I just wondered how, if that is an actual factor, I'm assuming, and how that's broached.
I raised nothing like that with the individual, but what happened was he had been in extreme distress, and I showed him a way of calming himself that immediately worked. And so he was a ship captain. So every time that ship went out, I was on board, because he saw the value of what a psychologist could do. And it was very gratifying and very effective. So, yeah.
Yeah, so really on an individual
Yes.
basis and to use our judgment. Yes. So for my part, as the chair of this very, even today we've gotten another 80% of power and influence, I feel, and I think the numbers are climbing somewhere if we had a tote board. So, so very pleased. We've been planning this event for some time. I really appreciate the participation of the people here, the people who've signed up for the roster, the people out there in virtual land that are tuning in to see this. And I owe a great deal of gratitude on behalf of all of us, and thank you to you, Dr. Charles Hayes, for providing this webinar today. Very effective and remarkable. Thank you.
You're very
much.
welcome.